Well, last week, you'll remember we went to great lengths to talk about the tradition that the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, were written by one person, Moses. And we looked at that in a lot of depth, and we decided that at least the scholars say no. There's all kinds of arguments why it doesn't make sense to attribute the first 5 books of the Bible to one person, namely Moses, who presumably knew the most about that particular subject, thus the reason for the tradition. Well, if not Moses, though, who did write it? Well, the scholars have come up with a theoretical answer. No, the answer is nobody knows. But there's a theoretical answer which has gained considerable support over the years. It was actually developed a long time ago in the 1800s in Europe. Other scholars worked on it and picked it up. I'm going to explain it to you. It's very complicated, but it does seem to satisfy a lot of the questions that we raised last week. Now, I've given you some Bibles because I want to try a little exercise here. I call it deconstructing the text. Oops. Let's go back. There we go, sorry. What happened was, scholars started to pay very close attention to the oldest manuscripts they could find of the Torah, which of course were all in Hebrew. And the more they looked at them, the more they realized that there was something peculiar going on, which is as you read through a particular part of the text, all of a sudden, abruptly, without any warning, the writing style changes. And it changes so drastically that it becomes very hard to argue that the person who wrote the first part wrote the next part. Because that's not like human beings, right? We all have a style. And sometimes, many times, it's very distinctive. We're talking now about an ancient language, which is hard to decipher anyway. So when you discover patterns, it alerts you, man, something's going on here that we didn't realize. This is how this works out. Now, I'm going to get you to open your Bibles because I want to give you an example rather than me just trying to explain it. I want you to kind of see what's going on yourself. Turn to Exodus chapter 1. I've given you the numbers here. Chapter 1, beginning with the 6th verse. And I'm going to ask you just to read quietly to yourself. You can go through it very quickly through to 22. Chapter 1, verses 6 through 22. Then you can just stop and I'll explain what happens next. Okay? It's the Exodus story, of course. Alrighty. Now, that's a very familiar section of the story. Reads beautifully, right? From 6 right on through 22. What happened was, scholars discovered that the first 2 verses you just read, 6 and 7, are written by, apparently in a certain style, but then at 8, everything changes. At verse 8, everything changes, and it doesn't change again until 22. Excuse me, doesn't change again until 13. So you've got 6 and 7 that are written in one style, then 8 through 12 are written in another style, and then 13 through and 14 are written again in the first style. And this process goes on. You can see from my slide here that they've actually identified multiple sources for that passage. Now, they don't know who, if you accept that idea, that we're really looking at multiple writers. We can't assign a name to those writers, we don't know who they were, but we can assign some kind of code to help us distinguish. And so the scholars have come up with these letters, P, E, and J in this particular side. You can see we have 3 different sources. They're calling them sources, not people, because we don't know. But apparently the writer is getting his or her information from a particular source, which is not the same source as the next section, the writer of the next section is using. So, and I'm going to explain why this is, okay, these different sources. One of the tests that they used to support this argument that you're really looking at multiple writers is, I'm going to do this on the slide. You can do it yourself if you go home. Let's go back and remove 8 through 12 and put together 6 and 7 and 13 and 14. Now read it again. We don't have to do this, but you can read it on the screen. When the scholars did that, the surprise is it makes perfect sense. There was no real reason narratively to put that other section in the middle. By removing that other section and putting those two back together, you have one source with a perfectly seamless story. So somebody, very skillfully, has come along and cut and paste. They've separated these sources out and injected other sources. It is a very complicated, time-consuming process. And the book that we've been using for our class, Friedman, Richard Friedman from the University of Georgia, he goes to great lengths to brag about the editor who did this. Maybe there was more than one, probably were in fact. Scholars don't call editors editors, they call them redactors. Because the idea you're doing more than just editing. You're making judgments about what you're saying. So maybe you modify a word, maybe you take some words out. You know, it's really extensive editing. So whoever these redactors were, if you go along with this theory, they were very, very good about taking multiple sources, people who did not know each other. Whoever generated these sources were unaware of each other, but they're telling the same story. So you've put together multiple sources who told their version of the story, but somehow you're making it one version. Now that creates problems. There are some contradictions, there's some repetitions and so forth. Scholars pick up on that, you see. They're looking for those little clues. Well, yeah, wait a minute. One person would not have written it that way. This whole idea of redacting the Torah is called the documentary hypothesis. That's the term. You'll come across this over and over again in commentaries on the Old Testament, because this is a very popular idea. It was more popular when it was first introduced. Since then, even more sophisticated work has been done, and maybe there are not as many people who are thrilled about this idea, but it's still a dominant theory as to how the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, got written. And Richard Friedman says it's a winner. You don't have to get involved in the controversy. The documentary hypothesis is correct. And he goes into all this reason why he thinks that's true. I'm going to give you a little bit of taste of it. Here's why those letters are used. The first source, which we think is the oldest, is the J source. The reason it's called J is in those passages, God is always called Yahweh, never anything else. Now, in a minute, you're going to see why this is a big deal, a huge deal for you and me as Christians. When the Germans picked up on this first, because they were the first to realize that this was a distinct document, a distinct source, they translated Yahweh into the German language, and that's where the Y becomes a J. So they get the credit for the finding, identifying the J source, which is really a reference to the name of God, Yahweh, okay? The next source that was distinctive was the E source, and the reason for that is God, in the beginning of this source, is identified as El, E-L, which translates into Hebrew as Elohim. You gotta, and this is tricky. El can be a name, it can be a noun, capital N, but it also can be lowercase e, which is generic for a deity. So if you say you believe in El, that does not automatically mean you've named your God. It could be, I just believe in a supernatural entity, okay? So you can see the problem scholars have already. When they come across El as a reference in these old Hebrew manuscripts, is it generic or is it really the name of the God? That becomes crucial to understanding what's going on in the Torah, as you'll see. Later in the E document, the name Yahweh the name El is dropped, or Elohim, and Yahweh is substituted. So whoever is creating that source believes that historically people believed in El and then believed in Yahweh. That raises the question, of course, was El a different God from Yahweh? Key question, we'll get back to that, okay? Very important. The D source, which I didn't introduce to you a minute ago, we don't have to worry about D because D is overwhelmingly the source for Deuteronomy. This is the Deuteronomic text, mostly, okay? And lastly we have P. You ran into P a minute ago. We're back to L. It starts out with L and then switches to Yahweh. So it actually does what E did, but it does it in a different way, all right? Yes, it's a little tricky, I realize. And you can read about this in almost any commentary, any book on analyzing the Old Testament has to explain this, because it's become so central to almost all scholarly discussion about who wrote the Old Testament, who wrote Torah. Or just the first 5 books. Okay, now, here's the problem, or here's why the naming is so important. When we pick up your Bible, when we pick up our Bible, Yahweh is not in it. Because the English translators substituted the word God or the word Lord, but they felt that Yahweh was Hebrew, and they picked something that would be more understandable in English. So you and I don't know if you want to call it a burden, but we have been in one sense struggling with this because we can't get out of our time zone and see the world the way the ancient Jewish or ancient Hebrews would have. It was Yahweh. And again, he's making a huge deal about this. You have to understand who Yahweh was and how he was perceived. So here's the explanation I gave you a minute ago. El can be either way. Elohim is the Hebrew, and notice it's the Hebrew for any God. It's not just for El, or at least it can be if it's used generically. And as you know, Hebrew does not use vowels. One of the many problems with understanding Hebrew, there are no vowels. So you'll typically see in modern translations this abbreviation YHWH, very, very common to run into that. That's Yahweh. Okay. The scholars have also gone back to the oldest Hebrew text they can find, and there are 2 of those. I've abbreviated them here. The MT is the Masoretic text. We've talked about this in previous classes. I won't go into all of that now. If you go to a synagogue today and read the Hebrew Bible, or have it read in the service, it's coming from a group of scholars long time ago, centuries ago, the Masoretes, and their text is called the MT for short. That's where the synagogues are getting their, quote, Bible. the Hebrew Bible. It's from the MT. We now know that there's another source that is much, much older, and you remember me talking about this, one of my favorite topics, 1,000 years older than the MT, 1,000 years older than the MT, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so scholars have compared the Hebrew version in the scrolls with the MT, and this remarkable closeness. Whoever did all of that copying and copying, remember, no printing, copy over the centuries, was very faithful to the early text. There were some differences. We don't have to go in that today. Always those two sources use the name for God, Yahweh. Okay? We have, now this little example very quickly, another reason why the documentary hypothesis is credible. It contains what are called doublets or triplets. Doublets is where you tell the same thing twice and they don't agree necessarily. And here's a good example. From the E source, God first reveals himself to Moses in the wilderness. But if you go to the P source, he first reveals himself to Moses in Egypt. Now that can't be the same thing. So why does E tell us one thing and P tell us another? Now this is where we get into the nitty-gritty. The devil is in the details, but so is truth. Okay? Just to quickly give you an idea. And you'll notice that in E, he's Yahweh, and in P, he's El. God is El. Actually, El Shaddai, but that's another variation on all this naming issues. Okay, now let's go to a question we talked about last week, and it becomes critical. Yes, Matt?
Can you help me distinguish if those different terms indicate an evolution in their belief towards monotheism?
Ultimately, and we're going to get to that. That's a very good question. And you'll see where Friedman is going with this.
Thanks.
Okay, was Moses a monotheist? There's a lot of discussion about this in the book and other scholars, and not just this book. The answer is probably not. And there's a whole bunch of arguments here. First of all, you can see what I put up here for you. I'm just pulling all these bits and pieces of evidence. The first commandment makes no sense if there's no other God. We go back to number 2, we go to the E source. The earliest, now I didn't know this, the earliest reference to the Exodus is not in prose, it's in a poem called the Song of Miriam. Miriam was supposedly the sister of Moses and Aaron. And she wrote this poem to celebrate the freedom of the slaves from Egypt. And the poem is given in the book in its entirety. There's a lot it leaves out, which raises the question, well, if she's the earliest, she was the closest to the event, how come she doesn't mention this, and this? You see the problem? Now, I'm not going to get into all of that. You can pursue that if you wish. But that's, again, why this documentary hypothesis comes back, and we have to consider it. Notice what she says in this song. Who is like you among the gods, Yahweh? What makes you special among all those gods out there? And the Song of Miriam, just in case, you should know there's another title, the Song of the Sea, because she talks a lot about water. Okay? Interestingly enough, just to tease you a little bit, she does not claim that God separated the waters. She talks about the waters being disturbed and the Egyptians drowning, but she doesn't treat it as supernatural. Another problem. Okay, let's see, keep going here. Here's a quote from a specialist in the Exodus. He was one of the scholars in that big, huge book I showed you. He contributed one of those papers, Johannes Osman. You can read it yourself. The other nations, meaning not the Hebrews, the other nations are neither foes of the Hebrews, nor their gods false and non-existent. On the contrary, they are very existent, and Israel must forswear worshiping them. Back to the first commandment, you see. Nobody's denying the existence of other gods. It's a question of who is superior, who deserves your recognition, who has authority. Okay? Not monotheism. This is not monotheism as we understand it at all. And scholars would argue it's not polytheism purely. It's something called henotheism. I had to write it for myself. Henotheism. Henotheism says there are other gods, but they are inferior. See, that's a middle ground between monotheism and polytheism. That's really apparently what we're seeing here.
Stuart,
Yeah.
is there a connection between Akhenaten and his monotheistic belief and Moses?
You want to explain who he was, why you're raising that question?
Well, he was the Pharaoh, some say the father of Tut, or the husband of Nefertiti, but he moved the capital from where it was to Thebes, or moved it back from Thebes. Anyway, he believed in one God, the Aten, and that's why he changed his name, the sun god. And then after his death, it was, everything about him was destroyed, and they went back to the other. But it seems strange that there would have been two people who were willing to accept this theory or something at the same time, or around the same time, or one affected the other.
Everybody hear that? An Egyptian pharaoh who very radically pushed the idea on his people that there was only one God, a monotheist. The answer is, Friedman wrestles with this theory that the idea, Moses got the idea from this ancient, a much earlier idea that had been promoted by the Pharaoh. Akhenaten lived much earlier than the Exodus, okay? So there's a big time gap in there. Friedman says no. He doesn't think, even though that's an interesting theory, he doesn't go there. He thinks wherever the Hebrews got this idea of a superior God, they got it from somewhere else, and I'm going to tell you where he thinks they got it in a minute. Okay?
Thank you.
But that's a good question. Because you read Egyptian history, this guy's very interesting. That he came up unsuccessfully
Yeah.
trying to impose monotheism on his people. Okay. Now, here's where we get to a biggie. Friedman asks this question. This is where he's taking this whole book. Is it possible that the people who became the Israelites, became the people of Israel, didn't come from Egypt into Canaan and settle, like the childhood story we all grew up with proposes? It's not the Exodus that created the Hebrew people in Canaan. The opposite happened. The people who became the Israelites never left Canaan. They were always there. Only some other element connected to them was actually in Egypt and made the Exodus back. Now, the beauty of this theory, and we'll talk more about it, the beauty of this theory is that it resolves that huge problem we ran into about how many people were on the Exodus. We said 2 million. If you're going to be true to the Bible, you've got to go with a number around 2 million, which is absurd. It makes no sense. We went through all of that. This completely solves that problem. We don't need a lot of people on the Exodus to explain it. In fact, there could be very few people on the Exodus. It makes perfect sense if we keep Israel back in Israel. and only have some element, some remnant, if you want to, that's not a scholarly term, in Egypt, returning, coming back, remembering their connection and coming back. How does Friedman defend this idea? This is interesting. First of all, you'll remember the Exodus story. The daughter of the Pharaoh rescues the infant Moses from the river, and adopts him, makes him her own child, and raises him in the royal court. It's a wonderful story, beautiful story. But the Bible says she gave him a Hebrew name. Now, why would we question that? We grew up with that story, it's right there. Friedman says it's impossible. Number one, she wouldn't have known the Hebrew language. Number two, she wouldn't have given a darn about what the Hebrews would have done. It's her child. She's the daughter of the Pharaoh. She's going to give him an Egyptian name. And Friedman said, now this is the expert in Hebrew, I'm not. He said if you look at every biblical figure in Torah who has an Egyptian name, Moses is one of them. Moses is actually Egyptian, not Hebrew. The reason the writer of the Old Testament, in the Old Testament, thinks it's Hebrew is because the root word that sounds like, the root word for the verb draw, D-R-A-W, is very close to the word Moses. And you remember, the Bible says that the Pharaoh's daughter drew the baby from the water, rescued the baby from the water. So to draw out in Hebrew is a word very similar to the word Moses. So the writer, who's writing centuries later after the event, just assumes, well, it's Hebrew. Friedman says no, it's Egyptian. He's 100% on this. So that's where he's going first of all. Moses was Egyptian. Born in Egypt, raised by an Egyptian princess. Okay, who would not have named her child after a Hebrew. Now, this is where it gets even more interesting, if you go with Friedman's argument. Every person who is in the Bible with an Egyptian name has some connection to the tribe of Levi. Now, so they're Levites. Let me see if I can go back. Here we go. Only J is not Levite in character. E, D, and P are all Levite. What's a Levite? Well, you remember that God sort of gives the Levites a special responsibility to be priests and teachers, to take sort of a leadership role. That's the way this is going to play out. So whoever these Levites were, they come to take that identity upon themselves. And we can, Friedman calls it priestly. They have priestly concerns, a priestly orientation, a priestly self-image, if you will. And he gives you a lot of characteristics about all that. Okay, let's go back. Now, let's see, this is Friedman talking. All Hebrews with Egyptian names are Levites. Not one person from any other of the rest of Israel has an Egyptian name. This is not murky. This is, we got this group with Egyptian names, and we got everybody else. These guys are Levites, these guys are not. That's what you hope for as a scholar, that you got a clean line. And when you get a clean line, it's so rare, it jumps out at you. That's, you can see he's building his case here, okay? Now, that raises the intriguing possibility that this little remnant in Egypt are Levites, and they are the people who made the Exodus. They're actually the people who were enslaved, who had this memory of a connection back to the Hebrews, who ultimately, with Moses, he's an Egyptian, make it out of Egypt and get back to the promised land. That's where this book is going. And for Friedman, it just totally changes everything. It starts to make historical sense, where you remember we bumped into all of these historical problems. He can resolve virtually all of them with this one theory. Okay. I'm not going to give you every argument he tries to make, but I want you to get the richness of his argument here. The priesthood of ancient Israel came from the Levite group. I just showed you only 3 of the 4 sources are all Levite. Only J is not. So we're getting most of our information in the Bible from Levites. We didn't know that. That's all behind the scenes, so to speak, but now we know. The Song of Miriam, now this is interesting. The Song of Miriam has a certain phraseology that is used, she uses it, about leading the Hebrews to the holy abode, or Legacy's mountain, or a sanctuary, or a place where there's a throne. Friedman argues that these are not terms that would apply to a mass of people. These are priestly, this is priestly language, temple talk, if you want to call it that, temple talk. There's no temple, but temple talk. This sounds like Levites talking. They would be the people interested in this holy abode. Remember, we talked about this years ago, the Jews did not believe in a God like you and I do, omnipresent. God was much more anthropomorphic. He had to have a place to stay when he visited his people. He had to have an abode or a sanctuary. Remember the burning bush? And God says to Moses, stop, don't get any closer. There's a line. This is sacred. You don't step over the line, remember? That's a concept we don't carry around. That God's over there and we're over here, and we don't, you know. So God had to have a place to stay. So he needed a holy abode, he needed a sanctuary, and so forth. There had to be a platform for his throne. This is priestly talk, according to Friedman. And it's in the first reference we have in the Bible to the Exodus. That's significant. There's another poem in the Bible, this comes from Deuteronomy, comes later, the blessings of Moses. This is where the tribes are named. The writer is starting to say praises about this tribe, then he talks about this tribe, then this tribe. These kinds of commentaries are called oracles. And the Levites are in there. There's an oracle for them, and you can see, here's a scholar, David Noel Freeman, says, of all of the oracles in these blessings of Moses, Levi is the only oracle with an explicit and necessary association with the wilderness wanderings. Of all the tribes, only the Levites are singled out as having a connection to the Exodus. Case is getting more complicated, but maybe more believable. I'm just putting, I'm trying to put this out there to be fair to him, what he's trying to tell us. David Noel Freeman, by the way, if you've done any kind of reading about in biblical commentary, you'll come across this gentleman. He's passed away now, but he was a Presbyterian minister who converted from Judaism and became a preeminent biblical scholar. Wrote prolifically, edited commentaries on the Bible. So if Freeman says something, it gets attention, just so you know who he is. Now, let's see. Oh, this is interesting. I had no idea. This is another one of the scholars who's contributed a paper on the Exodus. Gary Rinsberg teaches at Rutgers. He compared the biblical story of the Exodus with Egyptian mythology, What do we know about, from Egyptian history, about their religious beliefs, their cultural beliefs? And look what he found. This is the Exodus story as told in the first 15 chapters of Exodus. The story in the Bible repeatedly shows familiarity with Egyptian traditions, such as the biblical motifs of the hidden divine name, turning an inanimate object into a reptile, the conversion of water to blood, a spell of 3 days of darkness, the death of the firstborn, the parting of waters, and death by drowning are all paralleled in Egyptian texts, and here's the kicker, and for the most part, nowhere else. You can see this is disturbing. In sum, the narrative that encompasses Exodus 1 through 15 evokes the Egyptian setting at every turn. This is heavy stuff for you and me, particularly. So what we have here is a tradition in the Exodus story which almost mimics what the Egyptians claimed happened in their culture, in their background, mythically. We don't really care whether it's mythical or historical. The point is, Moses and the Levites are born and raised in Egypt and are absorbing Egyptian culture, and apparently brought with them back to Canaan some influence of that mythology. They're weaving into their story this grander epic vision of the Egyptians as to what happened. Okay, you see my last quote here, again from Friedman, it is the sources from the Levites that tell the whole story of the plagues on Egypt. You get all this and more in the Levite sources. If you read J, you get none. It's the Levites telling the story. Okay. Now, that raises the question, who were these Canaanites? If they're all in Canaan and they never leave, they're not on the Exodus, they're not Egyptian. Only the Levites are Egyptian, if you buy into the book. So who are the Canaanites? The answer is we don't know. And the Jews are very honest about this. We really don't know who we are. We're not exactly sure where we came from. The Bible says, and we talked about this, that Abraham, of course, lived in the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, and migrates south into Canaan, and ultimately his family ends up in Egypt. That's how we get Abraham connected with Moses. To oversimplify, I'm oversimplifying, I realize that. But that's kind of the connection. The J source is interested in a lot of that. The Levite sources are not, curiously. They're much more interested in the Exodus and what happened after the Exodus. That would make sense if it's only the Levites on the Exodus, because these are the priestly folks, or the people who perceive themselves as priestly. They're the ones who are taking all of this story, this narrative, this epic narrative, back to Canaan. Whereas J is not a Levite. J source is not Levite. They don't have that same frame of reference. Okay. Why is Friedman arguing for a Levite Exodus? The tabernacle in the Exodus, you remember back to what we said a minute ago, God had to have a place to stay. Moses created what he called a tent of meeting, also translated tabernacle. A tent of meeting, something physical that could be carried on the Exodus, set up when God and Moses had to meet, or when God had to meet with Moses and other members of the Exodus. And there are those encounters described in the Bible. The tabernacle of the Exodus has architectural parallels with the battle tent of Pharaoh Ramses II. You remember we talked about who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? The consensus is it was Ramses II. That's not the only theory, but that's the most popular. And it's true, the tent is described in the Bible, the tent of meeting, is in fact very similar in design to the tent of Ramesses. Both tents had to be portable, as an example. The Levite sources of the Torah mention the tabernacle or tent of meeting over 200 times. How many times is the non-Levite source? 0. He's building his case. Now, not every scholar is going to agree with this. There are plenty who do. I'm not giving you all of that. The Ark of the Covenant, another so familiar to us, the Ark of the Covenant. It's entrusted to the Levites. It has similarity in design to the Egyptian barks. What is a bark? A bark is an object that looks like a boat. In fact, it's designed as a boat. It will float, but it's ritual. You don't normally put it in water. You normally use it to make a statement about the Pharaoh or about whoever's going to use the bark. So it becomes a ritualistic device. But it is very similar, again, in design to an Egyptian. The Ark of the Covenant, remember they used poles to carry it. They put poles through the ark, and men would carry it through. Well, that's true of a bark. Again, portability. Historical connection now. Scholars are trying to put all this back into history.
I've been reading Exodus and have gotten to the, however many it is, 3 or 4 chapters, that there is nothing but descriptions, a description of how they're to build this ark. And why is that put in? I mean, it literally is nothing but description.
Yeah, that's another subject, but yeah, I mean, this is a big deal. The 10 Commandments. What do you do with the 10 Commandments? And if you want a real mystery, not for this class, but a real mystery is the ark disappears from history.
Yeah.
Even the Jews seem to have abandoned it at some point. I was just reading about this actually by coincidence. So that's not a real answer to your question. But
I mean, there are 3 or 4 whole chapters in Exodus.
yes,
That it's nothing but descriptions of so many cubits and cover this with gold and put jewels in this and on and on and on.
yeah, I mean, it's an epic story, and epic stories have all of these embedded symbols, if you want to say, that mean so much, that carry so much weight theologically or culturally. So that's not a great answer to your question, but I'm going to be careful to only tell you what I know. Okay. He says also 11 out of 11 references to circumcision, legalistic text in the Bible, occur in Levitical sources. 11 out of 11. The only people interested in circumcision are the Levites. Sounds very interesting, because they have to supervise that, right? 52 references to the sanctuary in the Bible identified as the shrine to which only Levites are permitted to go. They're only allowed access, only the Levites. So there's a strong connection between the two. Now, who were the Canaanites? I said we don't know. Originally, these 12 tribes did not get along with each other. This is a big part of the story in the Old Testament. They eventually sorted themselves out in a very asymmetric way. 10 tribes in the north, what they call the northern kingdom, and 2 tribes in the south. The northern kingdom was called Israel. This is confusing. The northern kingdom, 10 tribes, was called Israel, and the southern tribe, or the southern kingdom, dominated by 1 tribe, Judah, was called Judah. The other tribe was Simeon. In the middle, between these two, was the little tribe of Benjamin, who is, depending on how you do this, Benjamin was either absorbed by the north or absorbed by the south, but the point is, we always say 10 tribes in the north and 2 in the south, but that's the way it is. Little Benjamin was in the middle. So, when whoever was on the Exodus, when they come back to Canaan, they're going to go back to Israel, which is the northern kingdom. All right, that's just a little, it's almost like a footnote, but you kind of have to understand it, because he talks about that. You can see here, Israel and Judah were, why would he distinguish between the two? Well, that's the reason. Okay, there were 2 kingdoms. Israel and Judah were there for hundreds of years. Still, the mystery is from where they came, we just do not know. This is one of the raging battles and biggest unknowns in the Bible and archaeology. But what we do know is that they did not all come from Egypt. The group that came from Egypt were the Levites. Very radical interpretation. To imagine how many would be on the Exodus? 50, 100, 200, 500? Not too many. If we accept Friedman's argument, the documentary hypothesis requires us to drastically rethink the details of the Exodus. Now, I talk here about left-leaning and right-leaning, just to remember why I said that. If you accept the idea that the Bible, we all accept the idea that the Bible is the Word of God. The question is it perfect or is it human? Imperfect. It can still be profoundly beautiful and important and accurate if it still has errors in it from a liberal interpretation. For the conservative side, that's not the case. What we have here now in his book is a middle interpretation. It's not saying the story is 100% correct, absolutely not, but it's also not saying that it's all myth. It's saying, yes, there was an Exodus, it's just not like it was described in the Bible. Okay? That's what Friedman is up to. That's where he's going. Okay, now, who was Yahweh? Where did the Canaanites come from? We don't know. Who was their Yahweh? And this gets back to, I think, Nat's question. Somehow, by some process, the Levites came to believe in a special God named Yahweh. He revealed himself to them and gave them a unique tribal identity as priests and teachers. Okay, but who was this God? The oldest documentary source for the Levites is E. It links them to the land of Midian. Now let me see if I can show you that. Here we have the landscape of the Exodus. You see Egypt. Here you see in the middle the Sinai Peninsula. And over here you see the Middle East. If you look right down here, I'll put my finger on it. That's where Midian was located. It's on the opposite side of Sinai. It's east of Egypt. Okay? And you can see it's really kind of isolated. Immediately above it is Edom. Both the Edomites and the Midianites claim some connection back to Abraham. There is some, this gets tricky because we can't be sure, but there is some basis for seeing a connection between Canaan and Edom and Midian, okay? And we don't have time to go into all of that. You'll remember when Moses flees Egypt, he goes to Midian. And he stays there, gets a job working for a farmer who also is a priest in the Midian religion, whatever it was. He ends up marrying the daughter of the priest, and they have a family, and of course, then God calls Moses to go back to Egypt and rescue, quote, his people, the Hebrews, and you know the rest of that. So, to get to Midian, Moses crosses, goes east. To go back to Egypt, he crosses Sinai again. So, if Moses is on the Exodus, he's actually making his third trip across Sinai. He actually knows the place. But what happens in Midian? This is the big deal huge, for Professor Friedman. We know from Jay, Moses spends time in Midian, marries the daughter, I'll just explain that. We have other references connecting the Levites to Midian and to its neighbor Edom, okay? Is it possible that Moses learns about Yahweh from his father-in-law, the priest, while he's in Midian, and that becomes his understanding of a superior God, superior to all those Egyptian gods that he knows about because he's Egyptian? This is Friedman's hypothesis. And it's a hypothesis getting a lot of attention. Again, Friedman's not alone in this at all. But it's murky because we're having to read a lot between the lines here. Was Yahweh the God of the Midianites? Thank you. That would explain a lot. Where did this whole idea come from?
Is that saying that Moses then, when he crossed the Sinai, he crossed the Gulf of Aqaba too? And his father-in-law's property was in Midian?
This is tricky. The Bible says that Sinai, that he met with God in Midian. But the map makes that hard to imagine. Because the traditional, now, if you accept the traditional site of Sinai, whoops, sorry. Where do we go here? Here we go. Sinai is right here, the traditional site. Now, I heard a lecture by an archaeologist whose specialty was Sinai Peninsula. He says there are 23 locations claiming to be Sinai. So, if we go with the tradition, it makes no sense that Moses would have taken the livestock of his father-in-law all the way down here, and that's where God chose to encounter him. That doesn't make sense. So Midian would have to be somewhere back in here. Sinai would have to be, if you go with that. Now remember, we came across a duplicate version of the story that God spoke to Moses first in Egypt, not in Sinai. So we've got a lot of pieces that are not fitting very well together here.
Well, if the Cherokee tribe was motivated to move once, maybe the Midianites moved somewhere. Maybe they were somewhere else.
I will leave that theory to you.
We'll sign you up for next year.
All right, let's see here.
Cherokee.
So where does all this leave us?
Right here.
In the path?
Right here.
Okay.
I'm gonna put this together for you. Friedman is saying that the Levites, with their understanding of Yahweh, make the Exodus, go back to Canaan, back to Israel, the northern kingdom, and somehow convince the Canaanites that we're all one brotherhood. And as a result of that, we get the Jewish people, a united group, 12 tribes, and we get this remarkable event that the Canaanites who worshipped El, remember, their god was El, but the Levites say, no, Yahweh is really El. It's not two gods. All the while you've been worshiping Yahweh and you didn't know it. We are here to tell you who Yahweh is, and he's El. That's why we are one, we're not two. That's how we get the Jewish people. That's how we get the 12 tribes and everything that follows. And, back to Matt's question, by putting El and Yahweh together, it's the first sign we have of monotheism. Okay? And how do we get from merging El and Yahweh, because we still have all these other gods, how does the Jewish tradition explain that? How do the scholars explain that? And I don't put it here, but this is interesting. The explanation for how we get from that middle ground to pure monotheism is all the other gods die. See? So it's not a case of saying, no, you were wrong.
Yeah.
All those other gods never existed, they did. Polytheism is real. Back to the statement I read to you from one of the Exodus scholars. They were existent. It was just a question of who do you worship. Once those other gods have died off, that leaves Yahweh, the only God. And that's your monotheism, which comes later, not at the unification. But that's the first sign. Friedman would argue, if that never happened, we might not be here. We might still be polytheistic. But that's what's so remarkable about Jewish history, is it introduces this idea of monotheism in a very primitive form, but it does explain it. And the Jews survived through all the rest of history. And we have this dual legacy. We are Jewish in our origin, and we are monotheistic in our origin. That's where that book is going. And it was for me, quite a revelation to see how that all plays out. I throw it out for you. You can read the book, you can read other scholars, or you can say, no, I don't think so. Thank you so much.